The late spring sun hung like a judgment in the wide Wyoming sky, casting long shadows across the town of Redemption. The wind, ever restless on the high prairie, carried with it the dry scent of sagebrush and dust. But today, it also brought something else, something bitter and human. It swept through the main street where a crowd had gathered like flies on a carcass, drawn not by duty or justice, but by the promise of spectacle. At the center of it all stood Clara Mayhew. She stood on the wooden steps of the town courthouse, a pale figure wrapped in a faded blue dress that clung to her gaunt frame. Her arms cradled a swaddled newborn, her son, Thomas, who slept despite the heat and the noise. The baby's soft breathing and innocent presence offered a sharp contrast to the sharp eyes and sharper tongue surrounding them. Whispers rippled through the onlookers like wildfire in dry grass. She's the one killed her husband in his sleep. And ours. They say poisoned his tea, or maybe it was laudanum. Married for money, just like her kind always do. She don't look like no murderess. She don't look like much at all. The courthouse behind her was chipped and tired. A whitewashed building with weather-beaten shutters and a roof that leaned ever so slightly. Still, it was the seat of judgment here. And today, judgment was not blind, it was bought and sharpened. On the top step, towering over Clara like a storm cloud ready to break, stood Judge Gideon Sterling. His tailored black coat, lined with silver stitching, glinted in the sunlight like a uniform of vengeance. His neatly trimmed white beard framed lips drawn into a hard line. He held a piece of paper in his hand, but his voice needed no amplification. It echoed through the square, carried by pride and purpose. This woman, the woman Messon, he said, gesturing broadly to Clara, has betrayed not only her husband, but this community. My son, my only son, gave her shelter, gave her his name. And in return, she bewitched him, manipulated him, and murdered him in cold blood. A murmur of disgust rolled through the crowd. Some gasped. Others crossed their arms and nodded grimly. Clara did not speak. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply stood there, barefoot on the hot wood, her arms wrapped protectively around her baby. A breeze lifted strands of her ash-blonde hair, revealing a face drawn thin from sleepless nights and hunger, but her eyes ice blue. Defiant met the judges with the quiet fire of a woman who had endured worse than slander. There was no jury, no defense counsel, just Sterling, his paper, and the weight of his name. He didn't need law. He had power. She is a penniless orphan, he continued, pacing slowly, taken into our fold out of Christian duty. And what does she do? She murders a man 20 years her senior, my son, in his own bed, then clutches his child like a shield to hide her guilt. Clara's lips tightened. She looked down at Thomas, asleep against her chest. The baby's tiny hand had curled instinctively into the fabric of her dress. He knew nothing of poison, or lies, or grief. He only knew her warmth. From the edge of the crowd, beneath the overhang of the blacksmith's forge, a man watched in silence. James Jem Caldwell leaned back against the cool iron post, arms folded across a weathered coat. A broad-brimmed hat shaded his face, but his dark eyes didn't leave Clara. He had come into town for nails and feed, but what he saw now anchored him in place. At 38, Jem was no stranger to injustice. He'd worn the star once Deputy U. Isawis Shreeby, Marshal for nearly a decade before he traded law for land. His sprawling ranch, Caldwell Creek, stretched across 5,000 acres of rolling pasture in pine-shadowed creeks. He had earned his solitude with blood, with grit, and with loss. Now he looked upon the scene with an old ache rising in his chest. He had seen trials like this before, trials that were trials in name only. He'd seen powerful men wrap vengeance in scripture and cruelty in custom. But it wasn't Sterling's voice or the crowd's venom that stirred something inside Jem Caldwell. It was the woman's silence. It was the way Clara held herself upright, spine straight even under the weight of public hatred. It was the way she cradled that child calm, unflinching, like a ship refusing to break against the storm. It reminded him of something long buried, a boy dying in his arms, a mother hiding bruises behind a polite smile, a young deputy once too slow with his gun. The judge's voice rose again. Now nearing the crescendo of performance, there will be no formal trial because there is no need. The coroner's report is clear. The teacup beside his bed was laced with belladonna, and only one person had access to it. This girl, this widow, Sir Sarson. Clara's knuckles whitened where her fingers clutched the baby's blanket. Sterling stepped forward and extended the paper like a sacred relic. By the authority vested in me, I hereby declare Clara Mayhew guilty of suspicion of murder and unfit for the care of an infant. I will petition for custody of the child, pending his placement in a proper, God-fearing home. A gasp this time not of anger, but of unease. Taking a woman's child was serious business. Even in a town like Redemption, Clara finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but every word was sharp as a blade honed on despair. Your son died of sickness. The doctor said so. There was no poison. The lies who once so certain. Sterling thundered. From a schemer with blood on her hands, Clara stepped down one stair. Her eyes burned now not with fear, but with fury. I loved him. Maybe not how he wanted, but I cared for him. I bathed him when he was too weak to walk. I fed him when he couldn't chew. I held his hand when he died. Even the wind fell silent. You want this baby, she said. Louder now. You want to take him from me. You'll have to pry him from my cold, dead arms. From the shadows, Jem shifted his weight. He didn't move toward her. Not yet. But something shifted in him, as if an old rusted wheel had begun to turn. The judge snarled, realizing he had overreached. Enough, he snapped. This is not a debate. No, Clara said, stepping back up the stairs. It's not. It's a lynching in Sunday clothes. The townsfolk didn't know what to do with that. Some turned their faces away. Others found sudden interest in their boots. The wind picked up again, and a tumbleweed danced through the dusty street as if mocking the silence. Jem Caldwell watched it all. And then, just before the judge could speak again, Jem tipped his hat low and walked back toward his horse. He didn't speak a word, but in his chest, something had changed. He had come to town alone. He would leave it with a mission. And in the distance, the prairie whispered like it always did, carrying secrets, promises, and the long, it won, with Kinnan Mountain. Slow breath of justice waiting to rise. James Jem Caldwell was a man of silence by nature, by habit, and by necessity. At 38, he had seen too much and spoken too little. He'd learned that words were like bullets. Once fired, they couldn't be taken back. Better to hold your tongue and keep your aim steady. The ranch he'd built, Caldwell Creek, sprawled across more than 3.0 acres of Wyoming prairie. It was hard, wind-battered land, no place for the faint of heart. There were wild horses that never broke, cattle that went missing in snowstorms, and winters that stole breath from lungs. But Jem had chosen this life the day he turned in his Deputy U. Essen, marshal badge, and swore he'd never wear it again. The past lived with him still, riding the fence lines, watching him from the corners of dusty rooms. A decade ago, he'd been a lawman feared in 6 territories. He and his young partner Billy Harlan had brought in murderers, robbers, even one infamous gang whose bounty posters had hung on saloon walls like wanted gospel. Then a U.S. Soon, during a raid on a hideout in Montana, Jem had hesitated. 1 second. That's all it took. Billy had kicked in the wrong door, and a shotgun blast tore through his chest. Jem returned fire, killed the gunman. But it didn't matter. If we're in Sherrington, Billy bled out in his arms. 16 years old, smelled like peppermint and gun oil. Jem never forgave himself. He turned in his badge the next week and rode south. For 10 years, he built fences and barns instead of gallows. He talked to horses more than people. He bought land, raised cattle, and stacked coin high enough to never owe another soul a favor. But no amount of wealth could fence out the ghost of a boy who died because Jem didn't shoot fast enough. That ghost stirred when Jem saw Clara Mayhew in the square. It was the eyes that struck him first clear, defiant, and tired beyond her years. 19, if he had to guess, a child herself, holding another child in her arms, while a circle of townsfolk and one venom-tongued judge threw accusations like stones. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stood there, thin as a fence post and twice as weathered, clutching her son like a shield made of flesh and love. Judge Sterling's voice, all venom and velvet, rang out over the crowd. This girl poisoned my son. She murdered him in his bed to steal his fortune. There wasn't a single fact to back the claim. No doctor had confirmed poison. No coroner had raised alarm. Just a sudden death and a rich father's word. But Jem had been a lawman long enough to know that money often outweighed truth, and justice had long since stopped wearing a blindfold. He left the square before the trial ended, but he didn't forget her face. The next morning, The sun rose sluggishly over the prairie, sluggish and red like a warning. Jem rode into town for supplies, as he did every Friday. He tied his horse outside the general store, nodded to the stable boy, and walked through the door. Inside, silence fell. Clara stood at the counter, her back to him. She was holding a small tin of powdered milk and a packet of laudanum drops baby medicine. The shopkeeper, a rat-faced man named Niles Brennan, stood on the other side with his arms folded. "We don't serve murderers," Brennan said. "It's found them," spitting the words like tobacco. Clara didn't flinch. She placed the items back on the counter with a slow, deliberate motion and turned to leave. Jem stepped forward, blocking her path. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. He faced the counter, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a gleaming $20 gold eagle. The coin landed on the wood with a satisfying thump. "I'll take 2 sacks of flour, a crate of salted meat, and all the fresh milk you have," Jem said, his voice low and even. Brennan blinked. "Mr. Caldwell, and whatever the lady needs," Jem added. "Put it on my account." Brennan hesitated for half a second too long. "Minor Hanuford." The man scurried into the back room like a kicked dog. Clara stood still, her arms wrapped tight around the sleeping baby. Her eyes were wide, lips slightly parted, but she said nothing. Jem turned to her. "Wait outside," he said. She obeyed. Minutes later, he emerged with a small crate and handed it to her without a word. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off into the Wyoming sun like a ghost retreating into shadow. The news traveled fast. By sunset, every saloon and sewing circle in Redemption buzzed with the story. Jem Caldwell had spoken. Jem Caldwell had acted. It was as if the mountains themselves had shifted. Some called him a fool. Others called him brave. Clara, for her part, didn't know what to call him at all. She only knew that someone had stood between her and the wolves for the first time in months, maybe in years. That night, she boiled milk for her son, tucked him into a pile of quilts, and stared into the low-burning fire until her eyes ached. She thought of her dead husband, 27 years her senior, a man who treated her more like property than partner. She thought of the way Judge Sterling had sneered at her the day he delivered the news of her husband's death, and how his condolences had felt more like threats. She thought of the noose that had been dangling, metaphorically and literally, since her husband's sudden passing. Then she thought of the tall man with storm-gray eyes who had thrown down a gold coin like a gauntlet. She didn't know why he had helped her, but she wasn't fool enough to think he owed her nothing. Jem didn't expect gratitude. He didn't want it. He just didn't like the way the town turned on her like a pack of coyotes smelling blood. He'd seen it before. He knew the signs of someone being hunted by something larger than them, so he rode out to the edge of his land the next day. It was mid-afternoon when he saw her again, bent over the creek, washing linen diapers by hand. Her hair was braided back, her sleeves rolled, her bare arms pale against the dark water. The baby lay on a blanket nearby, wrapped tightly and sleeping. She never noticed him. He stayed in the trees, hidden by the rise of the land, but he watched, not out of curiosity, not even concern, out of duty. She reminded him of Billy's sister, a girl who died in childbirth at 16, left to fend for herself when her parents disowned her. Jem had promised the boy he'd look after her, but he'd arrived too late. Found her body cold in a mining shack, her baby screaming beside her. Another life Jem hadn't saved in time. He looked down at Clara's cabin, half fallen, roof leaking, and knew she wouldn't survive a winter out here without help. She'd work herself into an early grave, just trying to keep the wind out and her child warm. That night, he split firewood and loaded it into a crate. At dawn, he rode out before the sun and left it stacked by her door. The next day, he left dried venison, then a bottle of liniment for her cracked hands. She never spoke of it, never thanked him. But the next morning, he found a small cloth pouch hanging from the branch of a tree near his fence. Inside were 3 biscuits dry, but made with care. That was thanks enough. A week passed like that. A silent barter, a quiet alliance. He didn't know what to make of it. Didn't want to. Feelings were dangerous things. They led to expectations, and expectations led to mistakes. Still, every time he saw her hair catching the wind, skirts tangled in brambles, baby slung across her hip, he felt the years slip off him like snow melting off the roof. He didn't feel 38. He didn't feel safe, but he felt alive. One night, He sat on his porch, whittling a toy rattle. He told himself it was for a neighbor's kid, some ranch hand's baby. But as the shape took form in his hands, he realized he was carving the initials T.M. into the handle. Thomas Mayhew. He cursed under his breath and tossed the rattle into the grass. But the next morning, he picked it back up, dusted it off, and placed it in the crate beside the venison jerky. When Clara opened the door that morning, her breath caught. The toy was simple, carved from pine, smooth, balanced, there wasn't, the initials burned with care. She looked toward the ridge, but saw nothing. Still, she whispered, "Thank you," into the morning air. High above, where the trees met the sky, Jem Caldwell turned his horse toward home haunted, but no longer alone. The cabin was barely standing. Its roof sagged under years of weather. The door leaned crooked on rusted hinges, and the windows were nothing but jagged gaps patched with old flour sacks. Clara Mayhew stepped inside with her infant swaddled close to her chest, the creak of the floorboards under her boots echoing louder than the wind outside. Dust rose like ghosts with every step, and the bitter Wyoming wind found every crack in the wood. But it was shelter. It was hers, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. After the trial, the public shaming in Redemption Square, she'd been thrown out of the small room she'd rented behind the bakery. No one had spoken a word to her. They didn't have to. Her belongings had been placed in a single box outside the door, the key left on top like a silent farewell. She hadn't cried. Not when the sheriff came. Not when the whispers started. Not even when she spent the night beneath the awning of the abandoned train depot, rocking Thomas to sleep beneath her shawl. But now, as she stood in this broken cabin with its splintered walls and its hollow, lonely silence, tears welled in her eyes. Still, she got to work. She laid Thomas gently in a padded drawer she found in an old trunk. Placed beside the hearth, she began sweeping, clearing mice nests and cobwebs, patching holes in the roof with strips of canvas she'd bartered for. Her hands worked like they weren't hers, as if they belonged to a stronger woman, one with no time to grieve. And every evening, she sang to her baby, the same song she once heard her mother hum when she was too young to remember the words. "Sleep now, my darling. The stars keep their place, even in darkness. There's light on your face." James Jem Caldwell watched her from the ridge above. Each morning, after tending his cattle and inspecting fences, he saddled his horse and rode to the overlook. Below him, across the pine line and through the field of golden grass, sat the tiny cabin, barely a speck in the landscape. He told himself he was simply keeping an eye on his land's border, that it was the responsible thing to do. But every time he saw her, her shoulders squared, her steps steady despite the exhaustion, something inside him stirred. Not pity, not infatuation, something older, deeper, recognition. Maybe he'd seen that look before in the eyes of dying men who refused to go down without firing one more bullet. One afternoon, while watching her kneel by the creek to wash linens in freezing water, he muttered aloud, "She's got more grit than half the men in this county." His horse flicked its ears at the sound. Jem stared down at the valley, then turned away with a frown. He didn't like how often he found himself there. Trouble came 2 weeks later. It began with hoofbeats too many to be a traveler, not enough to be a posse. Clara was mending a tear in her skirt when she heard them approach. She stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. 2 men reined in their horses in front of her fence. One was squat, with a mouthful of crooked yellow teeth. The other was taller, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, his hands never straying far from the pistol on his hip. "You're the widow? Wes suckin' Pernanon," said the taller one. Clara said nothing. Squat man chuckled. "Judge Sterling says this land ain't yours. Says a woman like you shouldn't be out here alone. Unfit for civilized company." She crossed her arms. "It's abandoned land. I'm not trespassing." The tall one dismounted. Judge Sterling don't care much for legal nuance. He walked to the fence and gripped one of the posts. With a grunt, he yanked it free and tossed it aside. "That's mine," Clara said, stepping forward. "Leave it." The man sneered. "Or what? You'll curse us like you cursed your husband." He took another step forward. Behind him, the squat man nudged his horse toward the cradle, set just inside the open cabin door. That's when it happened. A single rifle shot rang out sharp and thunderous. The bullet struck the dirt a foot in front of the horse's hooves, sending the animal rearing. The squat man yelped and scrambled back. All heads turned to the ridge. There, Samamawin, high above, Jem Caldwell sat astride his black gelding. His rifle lay across his lap, barrel still smoking, eyes hard as iron. She and the boy are my neighbors. He called down, and I don't take kindly to men who bother my neighbors. The taller man reached for his pistol, but Jem chambered another round in one swift motion. Next time, he said, voice like gravel, I won't aim for the dirt. Silence fell like a hammer. The two men hesitated, exchanged glances, then spat curses and turned their horses, galloping off the way they came. Clara stood frozen. Jem remained on the ridge for a moment longer, then turned and rode away without a word. He came by the next morning, not to talk, not to explain, just to deliver. He left a canvas sack on her porch filled with potatoes, dried meat, oats, nenas or phone, and a bar of lye soap. No note. Created to shiver. No conversation. The next day, there was firewood stacked neatly beside her door. On the third day, it was a tin of kerosene, from fresh linens, and 2 jars of preserves. Clara stared at the items for a long while. Then she carried them inside and quietly wept, not from helplessness, but from the terrible burden of being seen, and helped without shame. Their conversations remained few and far between. Once home was sermon. When Clara asked him why he kept coming, he only shrugged and said, nobody deserves to fight alone. Another time, she left a tin of biscuits for him by the fence. The next morning, it was gone, and in its place sat a bag of coffee beans. They built something that had no name, something like trust, like alliance. Not romance, not yet. But Clara found herself listening for hoofbeats in the morning, and Jem found his hands carving a wooden rattle when he should have been mending saddle straps. He'd sit on his porch some nights, watching the smoke from her chimney curl into the sky like a whisper. And deep inside, beneath the layers of stoicism and old regret, Jem Caldwell began to believe that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth protecting again. The prairie had a way of pretending to be still. It could look so peaceful under soft morning sunlight, the sway of the grass, the gentle gurgle of the creek, the hush of pine needles shifting in the breeze. But beneath that calm, there were wolves, and some of them didn't wear fur. Judge Horace Sterling was one such predator. He sat in his parlor, not a hair out of place, sipping scotch from a crystal tumbler. His Eastern boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his mood was grim. He had underestimated James Caldwell. Sterling had assumed the reclusive rancher would keep his head low, as he always had. He hadn't expected the man to insert himself into the scandal, not for a nobody widow and her bastard child. But Caldwell had made a public declaration when he scared off the men Sterling had sent. And in a town like Redemption, where silence was safer than principle, any public stand was a threat. You should have shot him, Sterling said coldly to the mercenary seated across from him. He was up on a ridge. The man muttered, smart angle. He'd had him once. No way to get a clean shot back. Sterling swirled the amber liquid in his glass. She's defying me, and now the rancher's protecting her. That makes her dangerous, a symbol, and symbols inspire foolishness. What do you want us to do? Sterling set his drink down, rose from his leather chair, and moved to the window. His estate overlooked the town of Redemption, with its crooked chapel spire and slanted rooftops, as if the whole place leaned toward him for orders. I'll remind them who runs this territory, and I'll do it without firing a single bullet. In a courtroom no bigger than a saloon hall, Sterling convened an emergency session. He called in favors, twisted arms, and reminded the Sheriff Gable, a lazy, gutless man, that laws didn't apply equally to all. Within 48 hours, a petition was filed, matter Ontinas Fermin, custody of minor, Thomas Mayhew. Claim, Clara Mayhew is an unfit mother, under suspicion of homicide, financially destitute, residing in unlawful squatter conditions. Petition seeks immediate transfer of child to Redemption Orphanage, pending full investigation. Sterling didn't need to prove her guilt. He simply needed to create doubt. Enough doubt for the law to move in his favor. That had always been his gift, using the system like a branding iron to burn through anything soft or uncertain. He signed the document with a flourish, then sent the sheriff to do the taking. Clara was washing diapers in the creek when she heard the hoofbeats. She looked up 2 deputies, neither of them familiar. Ikinon rode straight toward her cabin. She clutched her son tighter and rose, wet apron dripping. One of them, a younger man with slicked back hair and a nervous frown, dismounted. He pulled a paper from inside his coat. Mrs. Mayhew, she nodded. heart beginning to pound. He looked ashamed. I've been ordered to serve you. Court petition, Ernesto Sharia Sardines. Immediate custody transfer of minor Thomas Mayhew to Redemption Orphanage until further review. No. Clara backed a step. It's not permanent. He added quickly. But until the hearing, you can't take him, she whispered, holding Thomas closer. He's all I have. The deputy looked away. I'm just following orders. The older deputy had already dismounted and was walking toward the cabin. I'll give you 5 minutes to gather his things, the young one said quietly. Clara didn't move. She felt the wind whip her hair across her face. Thomas began to cry. She couldn't breathe. Then came the sound of hooves thunderous. Urgent. She turned. Jem Caldwell. He rode in hard and fast, pulled his horse to a halt between her and the deputies, and dismounted in one motion. His revolver remained holstered, but his presence radiated heat. What the hell is this? He barked. Custody order. Sir Newat Serba Convenium Wasts. Mr. Caldwell, said the older deputy, from Judge Sterling. The child's being taken pending. No child's being taken off this land without a hearing. Jem snapped. The hearing comes later. Then you can come back later. Jem said, stepping forward, placing himself directly between Clara and the men. And you'll do it with a real judge. A federal one. This is a court order. The deputy warned her. So am I? He took the paper, scanned it. His jaw clenched. No signature from a circuit judge. No church witness. This is a forged rush job and illegal. The deputies hesitated. Neither wanted to be on the wrong side of Caldwell. Tell Sterling, Jem growled. He just made this personal. That night, Jem sat across from Clara in the firelight. Thomas slept in the cradle between them. Clara hadn't cried. Not once. She just stared into the flames with hollow eyes. I can't protect him, she whispered. Even with your help, they'll come again. And next time, with enough ink and paper, they'll win. Jem leaned forward. Then we give them something that ink can't erase. She looked up. I want you to marry me. The words hung there, unblinking. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. It's the only way. Jem continued. If you're my wife, Thomas is legally my son, a rancher of my standing. With a documented marriage and an heir, no court in Wyoming territory will dare touch that. But, she choked, we barely know each other. You don't have to love me. Just trust me. I swear on my land. Burn my name and my soul. I will protect that boy as my own. And you and Nashermai, you'll never be alone again. She looked down at her son, then at Jem, and saw no pity in his eyes, only purpose. She nodded. By dawn, they were in the saddle. They rode east to Laramie County, far enough that no one would know them. Jem introduced himself to a preacher as a widower seeking a quiet marriage. Clara as his bride. The preacher asked no questions, just offered a smile and a pen. Clara's hand trembled as she signed. Mrs. Clara Caldwell. That night, they returned to the ranch. Jem laid a folded document on the table. It read, Certificate of Marriage, James Caldwell and Clara Mayhew. May inborn. The years far 19, itinerary and 7. Below it, notarized and narration filed, Laramie County Courthouse. He poured a glass of whiskey and raised it. To lies that protect, he said. She hesitated, then clinked her tin mug against his. To lies that save. The next day, the sheriff returned. This time with Judge Sterling's men. Jem met them at the door, shotgun across his arm, marriage license in hand. This is my wife. He said. He stepped aside. And that's my son. Clara stood there in a cotton dress, Thomas in her arms, firelight painting her in gold. You take another step toward them, Jem warned, and I'll bury you in the pasture. The men left without a word, but Clara knew they'd be back, not with law. Weatherly, when he was blood. The prairie wind carried the scent of dried grass and something foreboding. Like the hush before a storm. Inside her modest cabin, Clara Mayhew stood still, her arms wrapped tightly around her infant son. The sheriff's words echoed in her head like gunshots in a canyon. The court has ordered the temporary removal of the child. She hadn't slept. All night, She had rocked Thomas and whispered to him lullabies that held back her tears. She had nothing left to give except this fierce, primal love that clawed through every fiber of her being. They were coming to take her child, and she was powerless to stop them. Until James Caldwell walked through her door, he stood in the doorway, the wind tugging at his coat, his hat shadowing his eyes. Clara had come to recognize the sound of his boots, that steady, unhurried cadence like a man who had walked through fire and no longer feared the flames. "They're coming for him in the morning," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. Jem said nothing for a long moment. Then, in for an one, with slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the room and knelt beside her. His eyes were dark and unflinching. "There's a way to stop this," he said, "but you'll need to trust me." Clara looked at him, exhausted and desperate. "What can we possibly do?" He drew a breath. "Wati Hanuman, desidikomen. You're going to say I'm the child's father." Her eyes widened. "We leave tonight. There's a preacher in Laramie County who owes me a favor. He'll backdate a marriage license. We'll say we were wed in secret months ago, that Thomas is my son. As his father, I'll have every legal right to keep him." Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came. Jem placed a firm, calloused hand on her shoulder. "This isn't pity, Clara. I've seen the kind of man Sterling is. He doesn't want justice. He wants obedience. And when he doesn't get it, he destroys. You need protection, legal. Permanent protection. I can give you that." She felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. A marriage of necessity. A lie that might be the only truth that could save her son. "But what would it mean for you?" she asked. "Your name, your land, your standing." Jem gave a soft, humorless chuckle. "My name hasn't meant much to me in years. And this land, what's it for? If not to protect someone who needs it." Clara stared at him, heart pounding. This man had no obligation to her, no reason to risk his reputation. And yet, there he was, offering her a lifeline, one built not on love, but on honor. "All right," she said at last, her voice trembling. "Let's do it." That night, under the cover of darkness, they rode together through the open plains, Clara wrapped in Jem's heavy coat, Thomas swaddled in blankets and tucked close to her chest. The stars above were silver and sharp, the prairie a frozen ocean stretching in all directions. They reached the preacher's home near dawn, a small stone chapel tucked in a hollow near a frozen stream. The old man, gaunt and gray-eyed, opened the door with a lantern in hand and smiled at the sight of Jem Caldwell. "Haven't seen you in years, Jem," he said. "Last time, you were bleeding from a bullet wound and swore you'd never come back. I'm here for something less bloody." Jem said, "I need a marriage license." "Today." The preacher blinked, then looked at Clara and the baby in her arms. He nodded slowly, as if he understood everything without needing the words. "Come inside, both of you." It was a short, solemn ceremony. No flowers, no music, only the whispered crackle of the fire and the faint whimpering of Thomas. Clara stood beside Jem in silence, his broad frame steady beside her as the preacher spoke the words that would bind their lives together in ink and spirit. When the preacher asked if he took Clara Mayhew as his lawful wife, Jem looked her directly in the eyes. "I do." Clara's voice faltered when it was her turn, but she managed the words. "I do." And just like that, the law no longer saw her as a widow or a suspect. She was Mrs. Caldwell, wife to a respected rancher, mother of his heir. Madam. They rode back home in silence, the horizon glowing pale pink with sunrise. Clara tried to imagine what life would be like now. Would they live as husband and wife in name only? What would Jem expect of her? What did she expect of herself? Her questions remained unanswered as they reached the ranch. The next morning, the sheriff arrived, flanked by 2 deputies and a representative from the town orphanage. They were met at the porch by James Caldwell, his new wife seated beside the fireplace inside, feeding her son. Jem stepped out onto the porch with a folded paper in hand. The wind tugged at his duster. "You're not taking the boy," he said plainly. "Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff began, "I have a court order." Jem handed him the document. "This is our marriage license, issued and signed in Laramie County yesterday morning. Clara Mayhew is now Clara Caldwell. This child is legally mine." The sheriff blinked. The younger deputy leaned over his shoulder to read it. The representative from the orphanage looked confused. "You're saying this child is yours?" the sheriff asked slowly. "I'm saying that my wife and I conceived this child before her late husband passed away. I'm saying that makes this boy mine by blood." You want to contest that? You take it up with the state, but you will not take him from this house." The sheriff knew Jem Caldwell well enough to know he meant every word. With a reluctant sigh, he nodded. "Very well. Here," he said. "But this will stir up trouble." "It already has," Jem replied, then turned and closed the door behind him. Inside, Clara sat frozen in her chair. Holding Thomas, Jem removed his hat and hung it on the hook by the door. "It's done," he said simply. She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude and something else, something deeper, a question she wasn't ready to ask. He walked over, knelt beside her, and gently touched Thomas's tiny hand. "We'll make this work," he said softly. Somehow, for the next few weeks, life on Caldwell Creek settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara took to her new role with determination, cooking meals, keeping the hearth warm, caring for Thomas, in, true to his word, never overstepped. He gave her space, respect, and support without expectation, but every so often, their hands would brush when passing dishes at dinner. Or she'd catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. And when Thomas cried in the night, sometimes Jem would get up first and hold the child, rocking him with surprising tenderness. The townsfolk were abuzz with gossip, but none dared speak ill of Jem Caldwell publicly. Judge Sterling, however, was another matter. Humiliated and furious, he began gathering allies. If he couldn't destroy Clara with the law, he would use fear, and he was willing to burn everything to do it. The sky over Caldwell Creek Ranch was a blackened quilt, torn with rips of lightning and stitched with the thunderous growl of an approaching storm. The wind howled through the cottonwoods and scattered the dust like a beast searching for blood. Rain hadn't started yet, but the air was heavy with its threat and the scent of smoke. James Jem Caldwell sat alone in the main house's front room, his Winchester rifle across his knees and a cup of cold coffee untouched at his elbow. Every window had been shuttered, every door locked. Clara and Thomas were tucked safely beneath the floor in the storm cellar, a snug hideaway Jem had outfitted weeks ago with supplies, blankets, and an old revolver. He had known this night was coming, ever since the forged marriage license had drawn a line in the dirt. He had expected Judge Sterling to try and cross it, but not like this, not with fire and guns. Jem could feel it in his bones. Not the storm outside, but the one galloping toward him under cover of night. Hours earlier, one of Jem's ranch hands had ridden in, breathless and pale. "You need to get ready," he'd said. Sterling hired out a group of bastards from Cheyenne. Gunmen mentioned at a prairie, he hin, 6 or 7 at least. "They're coming tonight. He wants blood." Jem thanked the boy, paid him double his usual day's wage, and sent him packing east toward Laramie. "Get out before the storm hits. Don't look back." Now, was doing as the lightning illuminated the ridgelines. Jem waited. He didn't have long to wait. The first shot came like a thunderclap, echoing through the night. A bullet shattered a pane of glass in the side room. Jem didn't flinch. He was already moving, crouching low, staying close to cover. He made his way to the rear door, kicked it open, and rolled out into the night, landing hard in the mud. The rain had started. Another shot rang out, closer this time. He heard horses snorting. Men shouting orders barked like wolves on a kill. Sterling's men were circling, tightening their noose around the house. Jem darted behind the water trough and returned fire, aiming not to kill but to scatter. One rider screamed, a bullet finding his leg. Another dropped behind a hay bale and began returning fire. Lightning exploded overhead, and in the brief white wash of it, Jem saw 6, maybe 7 silhouettes. 2 trying to flank from the south, another crawling near the barn, and a pair huddled by the front porch. They weren't drunk or sloppy. These were hired killers. But Jem had once worn a star, and he hadn't forgotten how to fight for what mattered. He ran low toward the barn, ducking gunfire, mud soaking through his boots. Reaching the side door, he burst in, grabbed the canister of kerosene from the wall, and flung it wide across the front fence line. Then he struck a match. The flames erupted like a devil's grin, climbing fast up the wooden rails and licking toward the hay pile. In the chaos, Jem fired 2 quick shots scattering the men by the porch, forcing them into the open. But he'd underestimated Sterling's desperation. From the hill behind the house, another shot cracked, the kind of shot that whips the breath from a man's lungs. Jem felt it before he understood it. A sharp, searing pain in his shoulder knocked him sideways into the mud. He bit down on the cry. Blood flowed hot and fast, soaking his shirt. Crawling, teeth clenched, he made it to the woodpile and slumped against it, rifle held loosely in trembling hands. His vision blurred. The storm roared. Then the world fell quiet. A different silence. A dangerous silence. A silence that told him they were closing in. Below Dia Marchin. Clara clutched her son tightly in the cellar, heart hammering like hooves on hardpan. Every gunshot above had struck her like a whip. She had begged Jem not to fight alone, had pleaded for them to run. But Jem wouldn't abandon his land, or her name, or the child he'd sworn to protect. And now, Masa Wankinam, above her, he was dying. Her hands trembled as she reached for the lantern. She lit it with shaking fingers and kissed Thomas on the forehead. Stay quiet, my love. What did Mom? Mama will be back soon. She unlatched the cellar door and stepped into the teeth of the storm. Rain beat her like fists. The flames from the barn flickered violently against the black sky. Clara kept low, slipping through the shadows toward the main house. Her dress was soaked. Her hair clung to her cheeks, and her eyes burned with something fierce and primal. At the edge of the woodpile, she found him, Jishamanon Yejment, pale and bloodied, slumped in the mud. You need to run, he rasped. Get the baby and... No, she said. She picked up his fallen rifle and cradled it like a lifeline. We end this, tonight. While Sterling's men regrouped near the corral, Clara made her move. She sprinted toward the storage shed halfway between the house and the ridge. Inside were barrels of kerosene and dried timbers. Jem had meant to use them for fence repair. She meant to use them for war. Clara smashed the barrel open with the butt of Jem's rifle, dousing the timbers. The walls were surely one, so even the ground. Then she grabbed the storm lantern and hurled it against the pile. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was immediate. The shed became a beacon of flame in the storm, casting huge, jumping shadows that danced across the grass and spooked every horse for miles. The fire roared, fed by fuel and wind. Sterling's men froze. It looked for all the world like reinforcements had arrived, that someone had lit a signal fire for cavalry. In the confusion, some turned and fled. Others shot wildly at phantoms in the smoke. Jem used the moment, wincing. He lifted his sidearm and fired 3 precise shots. 2 men dropped, a third screamed, then limped into the trees. Clara stood between fire and storm, eyes wild, rifle raised. Go home, she shouted. Tell your master his reign is over. A man turned toward her, his revolver rising, but Jem shot him square in the back. Clara didn't blink. Then, Kitchobersons. Through the smoke and ash came the final horseman. Sterling, he rode straight through the flames, eyes blazing, gun drawn. His white hair was soaked and plastered to his skull. His fine suit turned to ash and soot, but his rage kept him upright. He leapt from the horse, and Jem stood to meet him. The 2 men clashed like titans, one old and brutal, the other wounded but resolute. Fists flew, blood mixed with rain and mud. Sterling struck Jem across the jaw, knocking him down, but Clara was already moving. She fired a single round into the air, the crack louder than any thunder. Sterling froze. This land is under our name now, she said. My child will grow on it. My husband will heal on it. You have no place here. Sterling looked between her and Jem. For a moment, hatred twisted his face, then fear replaced it. He turned and fled into the smoke, vanishing like the coward he was. The flames were finally dying when Jem collapsed. Clara caught him, tears mixing with the soot on her cheeks. She held him tight, whispering words not even the storm could drown out. Stay with me. We're not finished. We have a life to live. Jem coughed, his breath hitching. You lit up the sky like Judgment Day. She smiled through the tears. You're damn right I did. In the days that followed, word spread of the attack and of Sterling's cowardice. One of his hired men, captured with a broken leg and a guilty conscience, told the U. Marshals everything. Within a week, a federal investigation had been launched. Sterling was arrested while presiding over his own courtroom. The charges were sweeping conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. He would rot in a jail cell, stripped of his titles and poisoned by the very corruption he once wielded. Caldwell Ranch stood tall, scarred but undefeated. Jem healed slowly, but he healed beside Clara, beside Thomas, beside the growing hope they had kindled with fire and courage. And when the prairie turned green again, the land was not silent. It sang with life, with lullabies, and with the promise of peace hard won by love and gunpowder. The snow had long melted into the thirsty earth. Spring in Wyoming arrived slowly, as if uncertain it could linger. But when it did, it painted the prairie in 1,000 shades of green and gold. Wildflowers bloomed in scattered constellations along the hillsides, and the wind, torrential, once bitter with frost, now carried warmth and scent of soil, of fresh grass, of life returned. Caldwell Creek Ranch had been reborn too. The old house had a new roof, new windows, and new laughter echoing through its halls. Clara stood in the front yard one crisp morning, her hair braided down her back, her boots muddy from planting flowers along the path to the barn. She wore a pale blue dress Jem had ordered from Cheyenne, something simple but soft, as though even fabric could speak of peace. She turned when she heard the door creak open. Thomas toddled out, arms wobbling, a triumphant smile on his rosy face. His curls bounced in the sunlight, and he shrieked with joy when he saw his mother. "Careful now," Clara called. Dropping to one knee, he waddled forward and crashed into her arms with all the uncoordinated grace of a boy learning to trust his legs. "You're getting so fast," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Behind them, Jem stepped onto the porch, leaning on the frame for a moment just to take them in. He still bore the scar from the bullet wound, a pale arc across his shoulder. But the limp in his soul, the burden he carried from a life of silence and ghosts, had all but vanished. He walked down the steps and wrapped both Clara and Thomas in his arms. "I've been thinking," he murmured. "That sounds dangerous," Clara teased. He chuckled. "We should build something. For the future." Clara looked up at him. "A future?" Jem nodded. "Something for Thomas to inherit. A legacy. Maybe a new barn. Maybe more. A schoolhouse. Someday, this land could be more than just cattle and fences." Clara rested her head against his chest. "Then let's build it, one piece at a time." By midsummer, the ranch had become a quiet landmark of rebirth. Neighbors, those who had once whispered about Clara behind drawn curtains, now came by to trade, to talk, to bring pies or request help with fences. Jem had taught 2 boys from the nearest homestead how to shoe a horse. Clara had helped birth a neighbor's calf during a storm. The town of Redemption, Tuyatitsu, had changed. Judge Sterling's fall had shaken it to its roots. A new judge, one with actual fairness in his bones, had been appointed. Sterling himself sat in a federal prison, tried and convicted. The name Mayhew was no longer met with suspicion, and Clara's vindication became part of local lore. Yet Clara still had nightmares rare, but raw, of gallows, of cold courtrooms, of waking to find Thomas gone. Jem knew this, and never let a night pass without reaching for her hand beneath the blankets. "I'm here." He'd whisper, and she'd whisper back, "So am I." Late that autumn, Clara discovered she was with child. She hadn't expected the tears to come so quickly, nor the fierce protectiveness that took root in her chest. When she told Jem, he simply folded her into his arms and said, "This time, no one's going to take anything from you." Thomas didn't understand at first. He poked her growing belly and asked if she had eaten a rock. "No." Clara laughed. "It's your brother or sister." He looked up, wide-eyed. "Is it stuck?" "Yes," the Nemesuanons. She smiled. "But not forever." As the leaves turned and drifted across the prairie, Jem began carving again, something he hadn't done since his own father died. At night, when I was by the fireplace, he knitted with Clara curled up beside him and Thomas asleep upstairs. Jem would take a block of cedar and work it into smooth shapes. He carved animals for Thomas' wooden horses, a tiny buffalo, a clumsy bear with crossed eyes. Then, one day in winter, Clara stepped into the barn and found something more. A cradle, not store-bought, not painted, just lovingly sanded, gently curved, polished with oil and care. "Jem," she whispered. He shrugged, shyly. "Figured I'd try." She ran her fingers along its edge. "It's beautiful." He leaned against a post. "I wanted our next child to be cradled in something I made, with my own hands. Not just because it's useful, but because it's ours." Clara turned and kissed him, tears already spilling. "You built this family with your hands and heart." "Jem Caldwell." He smiled. "No, you made it real." When the baby girl was born that following spring, on a morning drenched in golden sun and prairie bird song, Clara named her Hope. because that's what she had held on to through trials. Through darkness, through snowstorms and threats. Hope had been the lullaby she hummed to Thomas when she thought they might not live through the next day. Hope was what Jem had given her, quietly, insistently, when he stood at her side against the world. Now one of Fourier, Surastorizuarn, Hope was in her arms, tiny, pink-skinned, with Clara's eyes and Jem's serious brow. She's so small, Thomas said, peering into the cradle with fascination. She was smaller inside me, Clara replied. Thomas stared at his sister for a long moment. Then he turned and asked, "Can we keep her?" "It noise." Clara laughed. Forever. That summer, Relita Nawari Beforns, a sign was hammered into the front gate. Caldwell Ranch and Schoolhouse, Zurishiti, Dunwanatamar Tigres, 1882. Clara would teach the local children their letters and arithmetic during weekdays. Jem offered horsemanship lessons and ranching apprenticeships for the older boys. Neighbors began sending their children every Monday with baskets of bread and jars of preserves as thanks. It was quiet. It was modest. But it was a legacy. On the anniversary of their second wedding, the one done not out of fear but out of love, Clara and Jem took a long walk to the southern ridge. It was the place where Jem had once watched her from a distance, unsure whether he was witnessing courage or tragedy unfold below. Now my na sir. They stood there side by side, hands clasped. Arena were dish a morning room, hearts unburdened. I used to think love was something I wasn't made for, Jem said, voice low. Clara smiled. You were just waiting for the right person to show you how. They sat on a flat stone as the sun dipped into the horizon. Birds wheeled overhead. The wind rolled through the grass like a lullaby. What do you hear? Clara asked. Jem tilted his head. Pihar tunturana peace. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That's the song we've been writing. He wrapped his arm around her. Then let's keep singing. Epilogue. Years later. An old journal was found in the attic of Caldwell Ranch. Inside were pressed wildflowers, a marriage license, and a single page written in Jem's careful hand. They say the prairie is silent, but if you listen close enough, you'll hear it hum in the creak of saddle leather, in the cry of a child being born, in the whisper of a woman's breath against your neck after a long day's ride. That's not silence. That's life. We weren't meant to live alone in this world. We were meant to find one another, to fight for what's right, and to carry the songs of those we love, even if no one else hears them. This ranch, this family, this is our lullaby, and it will echo long after we're gone. Wyoming Territory, 1 year later. The wind had changed. Not the wild, bitter gusts of winter or the storm-ridden tempests of spring, but the gentle, singing breeze of early summer warm, kind, and full of promise. On the vast, sun-drenched prairie, the grass rolled like waves beneath a painted sky, and birdsong wove between cottonwood branches like ribbons of memory. Caldwell Creek Ranch, once a kingdom of silence, now hummed with life. Clara Mayhew no. Clara Caldwell now stood barefoot in the dewy grass, her skirts pulled up just enough to let her toes soak in the morning. The hem of her dress was damp, but she didn't mind. A year ago, she'd been shivering in fear, fighting for breath under the weight of accusation and survival. Now she was free. She was safe. She was loved. Just beyond her, near the fence that kept in the gentler horses. Little Thomas toddled through the wildflowers with uncertain steps, his cheeks flushed with effort and joy. His laughter, high and bright, carried all the way to the house. He'd turned one last month a small celebration with peach pie, a tiny carved horse from Jem, and wildflowers braided into Clara's hair by the neighbor girl. Now he walked, or tried to, and every clumsy step was a triumph Clara never tired of watching. She heard the creak of the porch boards and turned. Jem was there, leaning against the post, his morning coffee in one hand, a faint smile tugging the corner of his lips. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, sleeves rolled, and his beard had the early marks of silver. The wound in his shoulder no longer ached, but the scar remained an old reminder of a night when everything nearly burned down. You're smiling, Clara teased, brushing a curl from her face as she approached him. Must be the coffee, he said. She stepped onto the porch and slipped her arm around his waist. He let her continue. He led her and the warmth between them settled deep and easy. "I remember when you wouldn't smile for anything," she whispered. He looked at her. That steady way he always did, like he was measuring the world. And she'd become the only part worth keeping. Didn't have much reason to. And now, there, his gaze shifted to the boy chasing a butterfly through the clover. "Now I got two on Tunmin." They stood like that a long while, arms around each other, hearts at rest. The house had changed too. Where once it echoed with emptiness, it now buzzed with life. Curtains fluttered in open windows. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, and Clara's voice often drifted through the halls in song, soft lullabies from her childhood that now belonged to her son. Jem had added a new room, hand-built with pine and care. It was Thomas's nursery. Complete with a cradle Clara had sanded and painted herself, a patchwork quilt made from the fabric scraps of old dresses, and shelves of wooden toys, many carved by Jem in quiet hours after dinner. Each night, after supper, they sat together near the hearth, Thomas asleep nearby, and spoke in whispers about simple things. Cattle, common weather, water, memories. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just the quiet rhythm of shared space, two people who had once lived on the edge of survival, now held safe in one another's presence. The world hadn't forgotten them. News of Judge Sterling's downfall had spread far and wide. Some said it was justice, others called it scandal. Redemption had changed after that. The townsfolk walked a little softer, listened a little more. Clara still drew long looks when she came into town, but the looks had changed. Not pity, not suspicion, mere respect. She had survived, and Jemwell, he was no longer just a solitary rancher who kept to himself. People spoke of him differently now, with admiration, with curiosity. He was the man who'd stood between a tyrant and the innocent, and never once asked for thanks. Still, he didn't much care for praise. He let Clara do the talking, as he always had. One evening in early June, as the sky turned molten gold and the air filled with the scent of sage and cut grass, Clara sat on the porch swing with Thomas nestled against her. She hummed as he drifted to sleep, rocking slowly as the breeze played with the fringe of her shawl. Jem sat nearby, whittling a small bird from a block of cedar. "Tell me something," Clara said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "When did you decide to help me?" He didn't look up. "When I saw your eyes." She smiled. "That's awful poetic for a man who grunts more than he talks." "I ain't as quiet as folks think," he replied, glancing over at her. "I just save my words for things that matter." And I mattered. "You still do." Silence, but the kind that warmed instead of weighed. She turned her face to the wind. "You saved my life." A mentor didn't do. He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just rode along for a piece of it." She reached out, touched his hand. "No. You gave me a home, a name, a future." He swallowed, roughness in his throat. "You gave me something too." She waited. "You gave me peace." He rose then, set the wooden bird on the table, and walked to her side. Without a word, he scooped Thomas up and carried him inside, cradling the boy with a gentleness that came not from blood, but from the deeper bond of chosen fatherhood. When he returned, he found Clara standing barefoot in the yard, staring at the stars beginning to blink into view. He joined her, and together they listened to the wind. Later that night, in the hush of their room, Clara curled into Jem's arms. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked. "This debate stir," he said, kissing her temple. "Forever. You sure?" He smiled into her hair. "Ain't nothing surer. Wind'll blow. Storms'll come. But this what we got that's as real as the land under our feet." She closed her eyes. "Then sing me something." He chuckled. "You know, I don't sing." Then hum, "Sunatin nafinaltiturbin." Just once. And so he did. A low, rough sound, half memory, half promise. A lullaby not made for cradles, but for women who had fought and men who had bled, and the love that grew in the soil between them. Outside, the prairie stretched on forever. Inside, a new family slept safe, whole, so and finally home.